Hello, I'm Hadley Heath Manning, Director of Policy for Independent Women's Forum, and today I'm joined by Christina Villegas, who is an Assistant Professor of Political Science at Cal State University at San Bernardino. And Christina, importantly, is a visiting fellow at Independent Women's Forum. So welcome, Christina.
Thank you, Hadley.
Today we're going to be talking about the Violence Against Women Act. Some of our viewers on Facebook Live may know that April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And so at Independent Women's Forum, we want to be sure that we're having a discussion about the best ways for our society and for our legal system to protect women from all types of violence. So Christina's written about this for us before. You can see on IWF.org, there's a policy focus that she's authored called the Violence Against Women Act. And Christina's here today because I wanted to sort of get an update on this piece of legislation, which was last reauthorized in 2013. So Christina, my first question is just sort of a background question. What is the Violence Against Women Act? What's its purpose? What does it do? And sort of where does it stand today?
Okay, so under the U.S. Constitution, states and localities usually have primary authority over policing and responding to criminal acts of violence. And what the Violence Against Women Act did, it was first signed into law in 1994. It initiated a federal response to domestic and sexual violence. But based on the law was promoted primarily by feminist organizations and groups. It was actually written by feminist law professor Victoria Norris. And so the goal of the law was to initiate this federal response to sexual and domestic violence, but based on the belief that violence is perpetrated not by deviant individuals, but by a socially pervasive system of patriarchy and sexism. So the law from its outset had this kind of narrow ideological focus that violence is a form of social control and that it inhibits women's ability to develop as an individual and then as a class, both as individuals and as a class. And so proponents of the law, they rejected the idea that violence, particularly at the federal level, could be dealt through a system that encourages legal equality and seeks to punish individual perpetrators of violence. They thought that such a system wouldn't actually dispense justice fairly because of the underlying misogyny in our political system itself. And so they argued that federal intervention would be necessary to change attitudes and approaches to violence, to adopt more of a feminist perspective of violence, and then also to redistribute legal and financial resources to women. So from the outset, that was the focus of the law. Now, the law did a couple of things. It allocated billions of dollars over the years since it was signed into law in 1994. It's allocated billions of dollars to programs designed to provide resources for abused women, to strengthen the criminal justice system's response to gender-based violence. And so it's allocated funding to state governments to adopt various criminal policies like mandatory arrest policies, enhanced use of protection orders and restraining orders, aggressive prosecution measures, training of criminal justice personnel and legal personnel, training on college campuses to get to perpetuate this idea that violence is caused by patriarchy and sexism. And so much of the law is based on that funding that goes to the states or to different organizations in the form of grants. The law in its original form also had a civil rights provision, which was struck down by the Supreme Court. So that's the origin of the law. But from the outset, it was focused on the very narrow ideological grounds that violence is caused by patriarchy and sexism. And so the way that proponents of the law advocated the money be spent under the law was to promote that particular view of violence.
Interesting. And as a sort of a practical legislative update, the law was last reauthorized in 2013, supposed to be reauthorized about once every 5 years or can be revisited on that timeline. So what's about to happen? I mean, if lawmakers don't reauthorize it in time, what are the consequences of that?
The law will pretty much continue in effect without change if it's not reauthorized.
Okay, so when we talk about reauthorization, that's just an opportunity
to make changes, opportunity to improve the law.
Right.
So one of the problems with the narrow ideological focus is that it hasn't necessarily best served victims, women or men. And so for example, the shelter model for responding to violence under the Violence Against Women Act grants has largely been based on what's called the Duluth model. That's the model that was developed by feminist Ellen Pence from the Minnesota Domestic Abuse and Violence Intervention Project, I believe. And her whole goal was to demonstrate that in responding to victims of violence, shelter workers should recognize that males are primarily the perpetrators, and that violence is attributed or can be attributed to their desire to maintain power and control. And so most of the funding under the law has actually been given to local service providers who adopt this very narrow view of violence. And unfortunately, that's not necessarily always the case when it comes to sexual and domestic violence. There have been multiple studies and a growing body of research and evidence that shows that the desire for power and control is actually only the motivating factor in violence in a few cases, and it's not unique to heterosexual men. So women might use violence for the same reason, but there's a growing body of evidence that actually shows substance abuse, psychological disorders, marital instability. Those all are prominent causes of violence, and yet training materials funded under VAWA and the response to violence funded under VAWA doesn't address those factors adequately, because those factors don't fit with this presumption that sexism is the root cause of violence. So one of the main problems with the law is just this narrow ideological focus doesn't take into account the realities of domestic and sexual abuse.
Right. And in so doing might not serve all victims very well.
Right.
So I think that's a really important point. One of the other criticisms of the Violence Against Women Act that you've written about, again, I want to refer people to our website, iwf.org, where they can read Christina's policy focus called the Violence Against Women Act. And Christina Villegas is a senior fellow with IWF and an expert on the Violence Against Women Act. So Christina has written about the way that rates of violence in our country have been decreasing since 1994, presumably, and that's the year that the Violence Against Women Act passed, and yet there's not really clear evidence that the Violence Against Women Act is the cause. I took an AP statistics class one time, and I have to credit my high school teacher who told me that association doesn't imply causation. So how what is the issue there? Because I do think we should celebrate that rates of violence, all types of violence, have been going down in the United States, and that's good for men, and maybe especially good for women. It's good for anyone who's been a victim of violence to hear that those rates are going down. But how can we know whether the Violence Against Women Act has contributed or helped to improve people's lives? Well,
one of the problems with that statistic, it's pulled from a Department of Justice report, I believe, and the rates of intimate partner violence were going down even prior to the passage of the Violence Against Women Act. And the report that people often cite shows that violent crime generally has declined in the United States since that time, and domestic and sexual abuse has actually declined at slower rates than general violent crime. And so the question is, has the Violence Against Women Act been successful in causing that reduction? Well, we don't know, because there haven't been any adequate measures put in place to evaluate those programs. And in fact, I believe it was the Inspector General audited several programs under the Violence Against Women Act and found that in 90% of the cases investigated, the funds were not being spent according to guidelines or to service victims appropriately. And there were cases of outright fraud and abuse in the way that the money was being spent. And so the law is actually not audited to the same extent as similar laws. So there's very little evidence of whether it has been effective or not, because there are so few safeguards put in place or auditing procedures put in place to determine whether the law has been effective. And many of the proposals to increase accountability under the law have actually been rejected.
Interesting.
There were a few accountability measures included in the last reauthorization, but I think it was Senator Charles Grassley proposed requiring that 10% of the grant recipients were audited under the law, and that was actually rejected.
Interesting. It seems like there could be room for improvement, at least in terms of, measuring, studying the effect of the Violence Against Women Act and ensuring that funds are going to the right types of services and that those services are available to all types of victims. Are there any other reforms that you would suggest or areas where, the Violence Against Women Act could be improved if we look at this in the next reauthorization?
One of the main things I think should be done is to open up the playing field to all sorts of advocates for victims and their voices, because right now it's very difficult for people who don't adopt sort of the party line in terms of violence is caused by patriarchy and sexism. It's very difficult for them to even have a seat at the table to discuss evidence of best practices in responding to domestic and sexual abuse. And so I think one of the let me go back a little bit. For example, when grants are handed out to different agencies at the state level, they oftentimes have to go through these domestic violence coalitions at the state level, and they determine who will get the grant funding and which shelters, et cetera, will receive funding and which programs and which training manuals will receive funding. And they are oftentimes staffed by feminist ideologues. So those who are really concerned about violence and responding to violence effectively essentially don't have a voice in the process. And so I think that one of the main focuses in reauthorization should be to break that monopoly that narrow ideology has over the law, so that the law might be shaped in a way that it more effectively responds to victims of violence and the causes of violence.
Right. Wow. That's a really interesting suggestion, because you would think that everyone who's interested in working to reduce rates of violence against women or any other type of victim, that they would want everyone to have a seat at the table and to have a really robust discussion about all the ways that we can work together to do that. Christina, do you have any additional resources or things that you might say if people want to learn more? Where can they go to learn more about the Violence Against Women Act?
Well, I think the Independent Women's Forum is a good place to start. Then Stop Abusive and Violent Environments has also published quite a bit on the Violence Against Women Act. Unfortunately, not a lot of organizations have done work on the act because the process for reauthorization has been closed and has been dominated by a few groups. But I would say that those are two places to get started looking for further information.
Yeah, I think another reason some groups and advocates may be hesitant to speak out about the Violence Against Women Act is, obviously everyone supports the idea, everyone should support the idea of reducing violence in our society, especially violence against women. But
absolutely, it's one of the main purposes of government.
Right. But to criticize or to sound critical of the Violence Against Women Act is a politically fraught discussion. Right. So, but we have to talk about ways to make it better. We have to talk about it in order to do our best by those whom it's intended to serve. So I really appreciate your work, Christina, and I appreciate you, sending people to the Independent Women's Forum website. It's iwf.org. Again, I've mentioned Christina's got a paper there called The Violence Against Women Act for those of you who want to learn more. And we will continue to write about this subject. We'll continue to keep our audience updated, so you can revisit our blog in the coming. I'm sure this process will take months, if not, well into next year, as reauthorization's under consideration. So again, you've been watching Facebook Live with me. I'm Hadley Heath Manning, Director of Policy at Independent Women's Forum, and our special guest today. Thank you so much, Christina Villegas, who is an assistant professor of political science at Cal State University at San Bernardino, and also, very importantly, visiting fellow of ours at Independent Women's Forum. So thanks again, everyone, for tuning in, and thank you especially to Christina. Everyone, have a great